Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's session. As Dennis says, we have a very small topic to cover tonight, and so you might think that we'll be here all night, but fortunately that won't be the case. Tonight's topic is we're going to look at the biblical foundation essentially for the astro and geophysical models of the greater creation model. And so we're going to be covering quite a bit of material. But my main goal tonight is to get us to a point where we can have an appreciation of this, the cousin lecture in the second half, when we talk about the various empirical astro and geophysical models that have been offered by creation researchers over the years. So if we can accomplish that tonight, then I think we'll have accomplished the goals that I've tried to set out for us tonight. So, the Astroscience and Geoscience Creation Sub-Model. So we're looking at a part of the whole creation model. So let's take a look at our agenda this evening. Here we go. So we'll take a quick introduction, and we'll look at the biblical criteria for creation's astroscience submodel, which is what we want to do. We want to look at the biblical data that goes into developing our astrophysical model. Then we'll do the same thing for our geoscience model. We're going to make a few comments on the so-called vapor canopy theory. A lot of people have, over the years, talked about this, and a lot of people have abandoned it, and some people have continued to do research. So we want to make some comments about that part of the model, and then we'll have certainly time for questions and answers. So let's take a quick introduction here. As usual, we always have to remind ourselves about our approach to Scripture, and I think we've had this drilled in our heads enough in each of these sessions. The consistent normative understanding of the biblical text provides the biblical model of origins. So what that sentence states is what we've basically been saying all along, is as we understand the biblical text using the same rules of grammar that the scriptures were written by, then we will be in a position to ascertain the creation model that's in Scripture. Okay, so we can exegete that out and use that as our framework to create our empirical models. So that's one of our goals in this session. The biblical creation model provides the criteria and framework for creating a scientific model of creation and the flood. Okay, so that's an important statement there, that the biblical model is the foundation by which we generate our empirical models. The biblical model is used to interpret the field data, not the reverse. So oftentimes people fall into the trap that their model and the data that they extract from that model contradicts what seems to be the normative understanding of the biblical text. And what do? They throw away the text and not their model. And that's a problem, and it's a trap that's very easy to fall into. And then finally, the biblical model of origins is not limited to the origin of life, but includes life principles as well. So we don't want to restrict the creation model to just how God created. The flood came, destroyed the world, and the geologic column then was relayed down through the flood, and things of that nature. It also includes moral issues. It's the foundation of moral, ethical issues, and so we cannot forget about those things as well. So let's take a look at what criteria is provided in the biblical text that you and I can sit down and create an astroscience model. Well, we see that in the beginning, of course, in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And I think we've seen this before in other sessions, but the Hebrew word here for in the beginning is bereshit. And it's actually a reference to the absolute beginning of the cosmos, the creation of heaven and earth. And so what this would seem to indicate is that time is a fundamental constituent of what you and I call the universe, okay, the cosmos. So it's a constituent of the universe. It's a created entity. Time is a created entity, and that's something we want to bring into our model. Heaven is another constituent of the cosmos, and the Hebrew word here is shemayim. And what's interesting about this word is it's in the plural and should have been translated by the King James translators as heavens, plural. And of course we know by inspiration Paul defined that there were 3 heavens. Now the equivalent term to shemayim, as we will see, is the Hebrew word firmament, rakia. We have the earth. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And here we see the Hebrew word eretz, which in this particular context refers to the creation of the earth, matter, if you take the expanded notion or idea of this word. So all of the stuff of the universe was created in Genesis 1:1. So all of matter then was created in Genesis 1:1. And we don't have time to go into it tonight, but what you can show is that the entire universe, as it were, was a mass of water. That's what the Hebrew text calls tahom. We'll get into that in a little bit. The moment after Genesis 1:1, we see that the resulting cosmos was water, good old H2O. So the entire space-time continuum, if you will, the entire universe, according to the creation model, was filled with water. Okay. All the newly created space contained all of the newly created matter, which in this particular case was water. The text calls the waters tahom, which the King James calls the deep. The deep is what was yet without form because it was water. It was only water. So there was no form to it. There were no chairs made out of it, no carbon, no uranium and that sort of thing, no macromolecules. Everything was water, and it was without form at this particular point. All right, so at the end of Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, we have the universe consisting of space, time, and matter, and the matter happens to be a watery sphere, if you like to think of it in those terms. Then we come to verse 3, and we see that the text says, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Now, what's interesting about this is it seems that light simply appears. Okay? It's not that light necessarily was created, it simply appears. So the question is light an inherent part of the mere material portion of the universe, of matter? Light exists prior to the creation of the sun. Okay, so this is another interesting phenomena, that light, and it's a directional light, because we see this idea of day being defined, that light exists before the creation of the sun, which was created on day 4. We also see something else here, that the dividing of the light from the darkness indicates a specific direction. So you might imagine if the Earth is rotating on its axis, and this part over here is dark and this part over here is light, that would seem to indicate that the light source is on this side of the Earth. So there seems to be some kind of direction associated with the light in day 1, 2, and 3. Now the other interesting thing here I find out is that the word day here, our Hebrew word yom, which we talked about last time, is defined as this period with evening and morning. So these extremely well-defined and rigorously defined terms are defining what we're calling a day, evening and morning. So that would very clearly show to us, as we saw last time, that this period called day, the Hebrew word is yom, is a 24-hour period. The other interesting thing about verse 5 is we see this Hebrew word yom used two different ways in the same verse. Notice, and God called the light day, so the light portion of the word of this 24-hour period is he's calling yom, and then he calls the entire 24-hour period yom. It's kind of interesting. We see the same kind of usage with the word love and with the word world in John 17, where these words are being used differently in the same context. Very interesting. And what tells you how to interpret them? The context itself. All right, so the creation of the entire original cosmos and light took 24 hours, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And what's interesting about the Hebrew construction there is that the phrase first day in our English Bibles should have been translated day one. The Hebrew, Moses actually used a cardinal number, and the way it should have been translated is, and the evening and the morning were day one, actually labeling that particular day. It's a very strong way of saying that this is a 24-hour period. All right, next we come to verses 6 through 8. And this is referring then to the expanding of the great firmament. If you recall, in just a few slides ago, the entire universe was made of water. Okay? And we see that God separated the waters below from the waters above. And he places a firmament in the middle of these waters, and the Hebrew word for firmament is rakia. And you can kind of see it here in the graphic. So here we see the water in the middle, and here we see the water sort of at the edge as it's being expanded out. And this then is the waters above. So between the waters is this rakia, this firmament. So we have the waters in the center, the waters below, and we have the waters above, which seems to be the waters at the cosmic edge, if you will. And what appears to be happening is God is expanding the entire universe. And he's doing this by kind of sticking his hand in the middle of the sphere, so to speak, and pulling everything apart, leaving water in the center, and then using this other water to form all these stellar objects that we see in the universe. So massive amounts of fusion was going on at the time, I suppose. All right. So this is basically what was going on during the expanding of the rakia, the creation of the rakia, the separating of the waters from the waters. And of course, during this time, he created the earth and the sun. So what we see in Genesis, in the first week in Genesis 1, we see God creating the universe, and the moment he speaks, the universe exists as this watery, we like to think of it in a sphere, but I don't necessarily think it was a sphere. But nevertheless, think about, if you would like, if it's easy to think of that way, go ahead, feel free to think about it that way. But think of this sphere that God is separating the waters as he's expanding the universe. And as he's taking these waters, he's creating all the stellar objects in the universe from the expanding waters. Okay? Okay. Now, let's take a look at the nature of space. Many biblical passages speak of the heavens being rolled out and stretched like a scroll. And I believe there's a reason why God uses this simile, this metaphor, if you will, actually a simile if he says like a scroll, for a reason. And the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, Isaiah 34:4. In Revelation 6:14, and the heavens departed as a scroll when it was rolled together. Who alone spreads out the heavens? Job 9:8. So there are many, many passages in Scripture where it seems to indicate that God at creation rolled out the universe as you would roll out a scroll. Okay. And here we see all sorts of references that I have here for your own edification. So you can think of the universe then as this sheet of paper, okay, that you can roll out. And so there's substance to it. There is dimensionality to it. You know, if you take a piece of paper and you look at the piece of paper, it's a two-dimensional object, right? You can write on that two-dimensional object, but the third dimension is very teeny tiny, right? So you're actually rolling a three-dimensional object out into a larger three-dimensional space. So this is kind of analogous to what God did during creation week. Let's take a look at the nature of time. We've looked at the nature of space. Let's take a look at the nature of time. This is very interesting because you and I tend not to be used to thinking in these terms. Time has a beginning and a duration. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, the reference to the absolute beginning of time. Time starts ticking, the clock's hand starts moving, and so time is now going. What's interesting about this is 1 Corinthians 15:52, discussing the harpooning, if you will, of the body of Christ, of the church, says this event that people call the rapture is going to take place so quickly. He says Paul says by inspiration, he says in a moment. And you know what the Greek word for that word is for moment? It's atom. Okay, so with an atom of time, the rapture is going to take place. Now, an atom to the Greek world was a unit that could not be further divided. Okay, so it would be the smallest unit of time that you and I could measure or observe or to experience. But 1 Corinthians 15 says that it's going to take place within or inside, faster than an atom of time. So that would seem to indicate that there is a unit of time by which you and I cannot measure, cannot observe, cannot see. So fast that man cannot observe it. So the question then is, does this speak of a time element smaller than man can measure? And I would argue yes. So this seems to be the nature of time, that it has a beginning, it has a duration, and there seems to be a unit of time as the clocks tick, as we go along, that you and I cannot observe. There's a unit of time below which we can't measure. All right, so let's take a look now at our criteria for the biblical submodel of astroscience. On the macroscopic scale, consider everything we've looked at so far. Very quickly, I might add. On the macroscopic scale, space is viewed as a scroll. Space can be stretched like a curtain, as we've seen in some of the passages that we looked at. Space can be folded and bent like a sheet. And of course, we see in Genesis 1 that space seems to be expanded from a central location. So there's some of the observations that you and I need to bring to the table as we sit down and construct our empirical models of how the universe was created and how it even operates. Space seems to be bounded, that there's some kind of an edge to it. Now, you and I are creatures that are trapped in 3 dimensions, right? So we think that there's got to be some edge out there. But if it's a multidimensional thing, then the edge is something unique that you and I may not observe in the same way we would observe an edge of a table or something of that nature. So space seems to be bounded, and it seems to have an edge. Now, on the microscopic scale, this is kind of interesting. It is also viewed as a scroll. Okay? Now, what's a scroll made up of? It's made up of individual fibers, right? Membrane, plant material, fibers. Space is also finite. It's not infinite. It's a created entity. And so it's finite. And it's a created entity, and therefore it is not absolute. So these are some of the criteria that you and I would bring to the table and say, let's use these criteria to form our empirical models. Okay, so if we were physicists sitting down with our paper and pencils, formulating a model, these are some of the criteria that we would use to construct our model. Now, it's interesting, just as an aside, a lot of people have fallen into the trap of thinking that space and time have to be absolute. Okay, but they're not. Nothing can be absolute but God. Anything that's created is not absolute. So time is not absolute. Space is not absolute. Okay? And we need to understand what that means. That doesn't mean that it's relative in the sense that it teaches relativism. I think a lot of people have fallen into that trap too. Einstein's theories of relativity cannot be true because they teach relativism. Well, that's certainly far from the truth. Einstein's special theory of relativity says the speed of light is constant in all inertial reference frames. That the speed of light is constant in a vacuum. Well, that's hardly a statement of relativism. The mathematical equation that takes you from one reference frame to the other never changes. It's called the Lorentz transformation. It never changes. It's hardly something that teaches relativism. So this idea of space and time not being absolute is something we need to get over and understand. And it would take maybe another session to go through some of the fun ideas and issues on that. So these are the important criteria I think that we need to bring to the table. Okay, time. Time has an absolute beginning, Genesis 1:1. Time has a duration, the clocks are ticking. Okay. Time is quantized. It seems to be that time is made up of these little guys that when you add them together you get this duration. Okay, there seems to be a unit of time under which you and I cannot observe or measure. Time is created and therefore not absolute. Okay, now that doesn't mean you can go backwards in time or forwards in time. It just simply means that time can be altered, if you will. It can slow up. Light seems to simply appear. It doesn't seem to be a separately created entity. And matter is created and therefore not absolute. So these, again, are additional criteria that you and I can bring to the table to construct our astrophysical models. Now let's take these and make some abstractions. Let's try to make some conclusions if we were physicists here and trying to develop a model based on these biblical criteria. How could we come up with a model? What could we use to create a model that would help us to understand how the universe originated, which is religion, not observable. You and I cannot observe or repeat the creation event. And also, how can we come up with a model that would help us to understand how the universe operates? That is science. All right, so again, on the macroscopic scale, space and time seem to be viewed as a continuum, just like a scroll, right? Thus, general relativity can be used to model the operation of the space-time continuum. What that means is that we can use general relativity, the theory that Einstein formulated in 1916, where he viewed the universe as kind of a sheet, if you will, that you can bend, you can fold, and so on. We can use this to describe or to generate a creation model of how the universe operates. On the microscopic scale, space and time seem to be viewed as quantized elements. That is, there are units of space and time under which you and I cannot measure. So it would seem then, given that criteria, that we could use what's called quantum mechanics to model the operation of the universe. So these would be some of the ideas that we would bring to the table. We would try to use general relativity. We would try to use quantum mechanics to describe how the universe operates. Quantum mechanics, obviously, on the teeny tiny scale, on the atomic level. General relativity on the macroscopic scale. And in the middle of these, we have Newton's laws of motion and classical physics. So they should all form a nice continuum in each of their limiting cases. So for an example, in the small quantum scale, you would expect to find as you get bigger and bigger from the atomic scale, you would start to see classical physics taking over. So quantum mechanics in the bigger scale, what I call the MIDI world, start to be formulated using classical physics. As mass and size gets bigger and bigger, you should start to see classical physics kind of melt into general relativistic physics. And that seems to be where science is headed. So these are some of the things that we can use. So what we're saying is we can use these areas of science, general relativity, quantum mechanics, to create a young Earth, young universe creation model of origins. Okay? And so that is something too that creationists are now working on, using these very things. Okay, now that was a lot of information in very summarized form, and there's a lot more that could be said on that, but I think it would take many sessions to get into the details of that. In the second half of this series, we're going to be looking at various models that actually use general relativity and quantum mechanics, just to show you what's out there in the creation literature to explain the origin and operation of the universe. But the main focus tonight is on the biblical criteria. So you've seen what criteria the Bible contains to help us understand and formulate a creation astroscience model. Now let's take a look at the geoscience model. Not as esoteric, I might add. Well, there are three general components of the geoscience model. First, there's day 3 in creation week. We'll get into that. There's the Noachian flood in Genesis 7 and 8. And then, of course, there's this Peleg phenomena in Genesis 10 and 11. So there are the three areas that we'll look at specifically for creating our geoscience model. Alrighty. Genesis 1:9, and God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, Eretz, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herbs, and yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. Okay, so let's focus a little bit on some things that we can pull out of here now. In Genesis 1:9, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place. So he's talking now the waters under the heaven. We're looking now back in Genesis 1, and we're looking at the waters that God left in the center of the universe. Okay? From those waters, he creates the earth. He creates the dry land and the seas. Okay, so a lot of fusion in modern day terminology is going on here. So he creates the dry land. And so he creates on day 3 the antediluvian or pre-flood geologic column. So you might imagine what's happening here. He's gathering all the waters in one place and creating the dry land. So you can imagine the waters drifting away, if you will, from the dry land, sloshing about, creating these layers, just like what happened at the flood on day 3. So you would expect to find pre-flood layers created on day 3. Okay, so this is a reference to the creation of the antediluvian geologic column, and we'll see in a little bit why that's important. And then, of course, the waters that he gathered he called seas. Now, in verse 11 he says, "And God said, let the earth bring forth grass and herb yielding seed," and so on. So it wasn't until the creation of the antediluvian geologic column that God creates plant life. Now we can use that tidbit of information. Okay? You've probably, when you've read geologic material, you've heard of this term Precambrian, right? It's a reference to geologic strata where there are no fossils, no life. So you would expect, if you were to dig down in the geologic column today, you may come to strata that weren't washed up by the flood, that they were strata that were created on Creation Week, during Creation Week, specifically on day 3. And what wouldn't you find in those layers? You wouldn't find life. There would be no fossils. Okay? That's called Precambrian, Latin for pre-life. So these are some of the things that we can bring to bear on from day 3 of Creation Week, the formation of the geologic column. And let's take a look at that graphically. So here we see the sedimentary layers. There might be igneous rock here underneath, metamorphic rock on top. And here we have the sedimentary layers that were created on day 3. So day 3 of Creation Week saw the creation of the antediluvian geologic column. The entire antediluvian geologic column was formed in less than 24 hours. Plant life was created after the antediluvian geologic column. So no fossilization could have occurred on day 3. And that makes sense because death did not come until the fall. So no fossils present in the pre-flood geologic column, and those layers would be called the Precambrian, pre-life. The flood would have ripped up the antediluvian geologic column, according to Genesis 7 and 8. And the previous column would have been redeposited in the form we see today. So these layers, so what would have happened then? The flood would have come down, or would have come and dug up the antediluvian geologic column, which I have denoted here and by this line that I'm kind of tracing out, okay, and would have redeposited that material in the form that we see today in the geologic column. So these layers here, these strata, would be flood deposits. So as we dig down into the geologic column today, we are looking through layers that were deposited by the flood until we get down so far, and then we eventually run into the pre-flood geologic column. This boundary here that I have traced out is called the pre-flood flood boundary. It's a very important topic in creation research that we'll talk a little bit about here in a minute. A boundary exists between the pre-flood and flood strata. And of course this boundary may vary from place to place. I would not expect that the flood, that Noah's flood, dug up the antediluvian column to the same depth all over the world. I would not expect that. I would expect localized differences, zonation, if you will. The pre-flood flood boundary may also be identified with the appearance of fossils. So the layers that were laid down in day 3, I would not expect to find fossils. Now I may expect to find things like pollen on top of these layers that might have been placed there by the flood, but underneath I would expect nothing. All right, so the flood itself lasted roughly 371 days. The flood strata were laid down in slightly more than a year, and localized post-flood events would have occurred globally all around the Earth. So for an example, the Himalaya Mountains, they would have been flood post-flood. We know that the mountains of Ararat were flood post-flood creations, if you will. And many other items. The Grand Canyon, of course, was a post-flood. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. Also, there have been identified at least 50 magnetic field reversals in Earth history. So over time, the magnetic field of the Earth flipped 50 times, plus minus, plus minus. What we have to do is as we construct our geologic models, we need to include those reversals. So in this 1 year period, we have to account for all the magnetic field reversals that we find in the geologic column. Okay. All right. Let's take a quick look now at this event that takes place in Genesis 10 and 11. It's called the Peleg event. Now, I want to say one thing for us, so when you go back and read Genesis 10 and 11, that you kind of understand what's going on. Genesis 11 takes place before Genesis 10. Okay, not recognizing that it's not chronological can kind of cause confusion. Okay. So when you go through Genesis 10 and 11, remember that Genesis 11 comes before Genesis 10. All right, Peleg was born more than 100 years after the flood. His brother was named Joktan. And the text says that in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. And what we're going to argue here is much of continental drift, or as we have noticed last time, maybe we should be calling it continental sprint, is a flood, post-flood phenomenon. So the question is, did continental sprint or drift occur when Peleg was born? When did this exactly occur? I think actually the fact that the ark, and here's how we can answer this question. The fact that the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat seems to indicate that continental drift or sprint started to occur during the flood. And I would argue from an empirical perspective, it continued happening after the flood for some finite period. We know the continents are still moving apart by centimeters per year. Okay, so I think continental sprint, if you will, began during the flood and continued through the end of the flood, even to this present day. I don't believe, obviously, that it ended in the days of Peleg. I just think that it's a reference to the obvious distances now that we're looking at between continents, the mountain building that's a result of these continents moving. Also, the magnetic field reversals that are photographed have to be accounted for as well. And one of the areas that we find a lot of magnetic field reversals, or evidence for the fact that the magnetic field of the Earth had reversed itself, or has reversed itself, is on this mid-Atlantic ridge, which we saw last time. This mid-Atlantic ridge is essentially a three-dimensional scar, if you will, a crack on the surface of the Earth. And here we see the mid-Atlantic ridge here. So in the center here, this yellow line represents the ridge itself, and from the ridge, lava flows. Material, magma, comes out from the ridge, and it's it's heated above what's called the Curie temperature, where all the magnetic or the molecules of the material can move, can align themselves. Well, as the molecule, so if the magnetic field is pointed in a particular direction, these molecules that are now free to move about will align themselves with the magnetic field. Well, once the material cools below what's called the Curie point, those molecules are locked into that orientation. Okay? So as the magma moves out from the mid-Atlantic ridge, you see these molecules reverse themselves as the magnetic field reverses. And that's exactly what we see here. And we can account for at least 50 of these during this event. Okay. So this is a really interesting phenomenon that we see at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Now, let's take a look at the Grand Canyon. We're going to be taking a more detailed look at the Grand Canyon in the second half of this series, so we'll just kind of touch base on it here. But here we see a cut set of the Grand Canyon. Here we see on top, we see some volcanoes, the little sisters, if you will. They have dumped their lava down into the canyon. And in fact, this actually occurred after the canyon was formed. The volcanoes erupted, and the magma came down the side and blocked the canyon and created a dam. So what we see here, if you notice this cut set here, notice the lower layers, the Vishnu schist, the Bass shale, and so on. These layers are angled. The reason they're angled is because they were uplifted. They were uplifted sometime before or during the flood. The flood ripped up the material. These lower layers are uplifted then. Okay, so they're uplifted. The flood comes and rips the layers up down to this layer here where we see them all angled here. And then the flood, of course, redeposits this material on top of these uplifted layers. This boundary here that we see between the uplifted layers and the horizontal layers, if you notice that the peat sandstone is right here is the bottom layer. These are flood layers. Below are pre-flood or antediluvian layers. And this boundary here is the flood, pre-flood boundary. In the Grand Canyon, it's called the Great Unconformity. Okay? It is so incredibly obvious when you're there. You can see, as you're looking across in places of the Grand Canyon, you can look and see this very boundary. And one of the camps that some of the Colorado River rafting tours have, there's a campsite where you can actually lie down on antediluvian layers and hit your head as you wake up in the morning on flood layers. That happened to happen to me when I was there. So this is the kind of thing that we see at the Grand Canyon, and we see this wonderful thing called the Great Unconformity. So here we see Precambrian, if you will, antediluvian layers, and above that we see flood layers. Okay? So we would expect to find fossils in these layers, such as the red wall limestone. Massive numbers of fossils in these layers. So this is kind of the a quick look at the Grand Canyon. We'll take another look at that in our second half of this series. Let's take a quick look at the entire, basically, Colorado Plateau. Notice that these layers here, they're bent. You can see the uplifting of the Grand Canyon here. Now, right here on these, what seems to be a set of cliffs, if you will, Zion National Park, right here we see in G, Bryce Canyon. That happens to be my favorite canyon. It's absolutely gorgeous. The rocks, the hoodoos that are there are very bright orange, and they seem to be remnants of massive erosion, and what we see are the elements that remained after the erosion, the core, if you will. I don't know if you've ever seen or been to Bryce Canyon, but it's well worth the trip. Notice that it's furthest away from the Grand Canyon relative to this picture. Now we see here in D, right here, Zion National Park. It's a large canyon, kind of eerie when you're there. I don't like it as well as Bryce Canyon. For me, it seems eerie for some reason. But again, it's a result of catastrophic dredging, if you will, catastrophic flood. Then we come, of course, to the Grand Canyon. Now, one of the interesting things here is all these layers here that are represented here for Bryce Canyon, Zion National Park, and so on. These are all flood layers. And all these geologic structures were created post-flood. So these layers were laid down by the flood, then subsequent localized catastrophes occurred that created each one of these particular geologic oddities, if you will. Notice the Grand Canyon. Notice that it's uplifted. Well, if the Colorado River created that canyon, the water would have to go uphill. Well, of course, that doesn't happen. The only way that could happen is if there was some catastrophic breach of a post-flood lake or sets of lakes or set of lakes that carved the canyon through a catastrophic dredging of these layers. And that's precisely what the creation model discusses, and we'll get into the details of that in the second half of this series. So there's some interesting things we're going to be looking at, but this is kind of a very high-level overview of the Colorado Plateau and the geologic column. This is Mount St. Helens. This was considered the prettiest of peaks in the Cascade Mountains, and the lake before us is Spirit Lake. It's a cold lake, I might add. And of course, we know what happened on May 18th, 1980. Mount St. Helens erupted, and the eruption actually was a lateral blast in the northern direction and essentially washed out Spirit Lake, and there was a massive tidal wave, if you will, caused on Spirit Lake, and on the bottom of Spirit Lake was the bark of a lot of fir trees, Douglas fir trees, and conifers, and so on. And the layers that were laid down by the blast and I'm saying layers, were actually stratified. We're going to look at this in detail in the second half of this series as well. But during Mount St. Helens, the blast is called a pyroclastic eruption. It's essentially where water, steam, is created through the hot magma underneath the volcano, creating all this pressure, and Mount St. Helens literally blew its top, but it blew it in a way, a lateral blast northward over the mountains. And that caused a lot of very interesting geologic features that we see throughout the world. So for an example, we have hundreds of feet of layers that were created by this blast cloud that is traveling at 200 miles an hour out of the volcano at 700 degrees centigrade, and you would not expect to find stratification in this, what seems to be random, chaotic blast. But that's exactly what happened. We'll see pictures of this. 2 years later, this strata, there was massive drainage due to glacial ice and water, and through this strata there were mud flows. These are called lahars, and they dredged the strata that was formed through the eruption. They dredged canyons, and the erosion patterns of these canyons is precisely what you see at the Grand Canyon. Very sharp erosion patterns, not this smooth, rounded, but very sharp erosion patterns, something you would expect in a catastrophic dredging like the Grand Canyon. And so we see at Mount St. Helens a picture of how the Grand Canyon could have been formed not so much by a steam blast, but by catastrophic dredging through water flow, and so on. So there's a lot of things that transpired at Mount St. Helens that we can use to construct our models. Now let's take a look at the geologic column and how we can use the biblical model in constructing our own geologic models. Well, day 3 was a 24-hour period, right? On top of that came the post-creation or pre-flood era. Okay, so there was 1,656 years from creation to the flood. So a much longer time than day 3, 24 hours versus almost 1,700 years. Then we come to an event that lasted 370 or 71 days, Noah's flood. Excuse me, and that's a very small time frame, only a year. And then we come to the period that we're living in now, the post-flood era. But what's interesting about this is the following. This 3-day period actually created a huge portion of the geologic column. The flood then created another huge portion of the geologic column. So it seems that small periods of catastrophe created huge chunks, if you will, of the geologic column. So that would mean that the geologic column that we see on the Earth today and even before the flood was mostly formed by catastrophic processes. Now today we don't live in a period of catastrophism, we live in a period of uniformity. So we would expect to see very small changes in the geologic and geographical features of the Earth. So long periods of uniformity create very little pieces of the geologic column. And of course we see transient events in the post-flood era. So in this post-flood era, we would expect to see the Grand Canyon form. We might see some mountain building form and things of that nature. But the main geologic column is intact. And you can ignore my comments on the Steelers today. Okay. So let's take a look at the criteria that we want to utilize as we create our geoscience submodel. The antediluvian column was created without fossils. The flood ripped up and redeposited material in essentially the present-day column. The main part of the flood lasted 370 days. And continental sprint occurred during and after the flood. And the majority of fossils that we see today resulted from the flood. So these are some of the criteria that we can use as we create our geoscience model. And of course, probably the most important element is that this all occurred within the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. And the fact that the biblical text speaks of a young earth is very important, because that provides the boundary conditions that we bring to the table when we create our model. So we would create the geoscience model that utilizes, has as a fundamental element youth, a young earth. All right, so let's take a look at some comments now on the vapor canopy. The vapor canopy supposedly was created on day one. God separated the waters, the outer band, far beyond the Earth's atmosphere. And there is actually no direct reference to this vapor canopy in Scripture at all. There's no reference at all to an earthbound canopy. There's not even a hint to it in the biblical text. But does that mean that you and I cannot use such a concept in our empirical models? The answer to that is no. It gives us complete freedom to do so. Just because the text doesn't say it, what we can say is as God separated the waters, He left a remnant of waters around the earth and formulated a canopy around the earth to construct the antediluvian or pre-flood atmosphere of the earth. So we can use that idea to construct a model of the antediluvian atmosphere. All right, so the separating of the waters allows us, however, for residual waters to be used in some way for a canopy. So there is freedom to produce a canopy model for the modeling of the antediluvian atmosphere. And there have been various models offered by creationists. The cloud model, that when God separated the waters, He created this canopy around the earth that was in the form of a cloud, a massive cloud around the entire earth. Well, you can use that as a model, but you run into problems almost immediately. Then there are those who held to an ice model, that there was a rigid ice canopy around the earth. You can obviously see the problems there. It's not going to be too long before that thing is destroyed, very unstable. Then, of course, there's the vapor canopy model, which was rigorously modeled by Joseph Dillow in his book, The Waters Above, and then Larry Vardaman of the Institute for Creation Research took up that research and did a lot of work. And what was interesting about some of Larry's work, as well as others, was that there's a problem with the heat capacity content of water in the atmosphere. If you remember from your 8th grade science that water holds heat, right? Well, if there is enough water in the upper atmosphere to produce 40 days of rain, then the heat capacity of the canopy itself would be enough to boil the surface of the earth. So there are heat problems with the currently modeled vapor canopy model. So that needs to be looked at again. It needs to be further researched. Then finally, there's a fourth candidate, which has not been as vigorously modeled, and I don't know why, because it offers promise, actually, and that's the CO2 canopy model, carbon dioxide. And it doesn't suffer from the same problems that the water canopy model does. But nevertheless, we're free to offer a canopy in our geoscience model, our model of the Earth's atmosphere, and we can discuss that then at our convenience, if you will. So the point being is that the biblical text provides us freedom to construct these empirical models to model the antediluvian, the post-flood column, the entire geoscience model of the earth from a creationist perspective. We can utilize the canopy model if we wish to model the earth's atmosphere and so on. So the biblical text should provide us the foundation and the boundary conditions by which we can use and construct models of these various parts of the greater creation model. Tonight we looked at the astroscience model and the geoscience model. So we covered an awful lot of material tonight in a very short period of time, I might add, and there's so much more we can discuss in detail, which we will leave to the second half of this series. So I'm going to stop there, and we can open it up for questions if anyone has any questions.